Okay, welcome everyone to today's session of the Anti-Corruption Train the Trainer program organized jointly by the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, Committee on Anti-Corruption, and Globethics MENA Center. Today's session will be the second in the series of 16 workshops, which will be engaging between now October 2024 all the way to June 2025. We want to thank you all for your continued support, your time and commitment to the training sessions. I believe we had an insightful time when we met on the 10th of October, where we launched this program, and we went to the first workshop with Neill Stansbury. Today, we are going into the second workshop session, and today's topic will be on contractual structure, rights and obligations on infrastructure projects. Again, Neill Stansbury, the co-founder and director of the GIACC International, will be taking us through the presentation today. As usual, please introduce yourselves. You're all very welcome. Introduce yourself using the chat box. Let us know your name, where you are joining us from, your organization, which country you're joining us from. And also, please send all your questions and comments to the Q&A box. Our speaker and panelists will make every effort to answer all your questions. As much as possible, we'll try to answer them live. Otherwise, we'll answer them right there in the Q&A box. You're welcome again. I'm excited to have you all here today again. My name is Susan Ackah. I am the training coordinator for the Anti-Corruption Train the Trainer program. And I welcome you. I keep welcoming you, yes, because I'm happy to see you all here today. Now, before we go into the presentation, allow me to welcome Mr. Kamel Ayadi, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Anti-Corruption for the World Federation of Engineering Organizations. He is moderating our meeting today. So I will hand over now to Kamel. Kamel, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I have also two other hats. One hat is as a member affiliate of the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center and the Regional Council of Globethics. Yeah, so hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Welcome to this second session in the series of master class. I'm delighted that the number of participants is steadily increasing. Thank you for your interest in this initiative, and I hope that you will remain numerous and motivated on this long journey, because this program will conclude within 9 months. Today we have Neill Stansbury, as it was highlighted by Susan, as our guest instructor for the second time. I thank you, Neill, for the time and commitment to this activity, and welcome the panelists. I welcome Michael Kramer, who will be our panelist, and we will have other panelists who will be chosen from the participant who wanted to participate as a panelist. And I will go to that later. For those who were not at the last session, because today is our second session, the topic of last session was why infrastructure projects are prone to corruption. In this session, Neill introduced us to the complicated contractual structure and long chain of parties involved in infrastructure projects, project owners, funders, contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, consultants, and so on, and explained how these parties can facilitate corruption. From this complexity arises other great complexities related to the multiplicity of project phases, diversity of skills, intermediaries, and contractual documentation, which can contain hundreds of pages of contract conditions, technical specification, bills of quantities, drawing, and program, which also explain the vulnerability of infrastructures projected to corruption and the ability to conceal corruption. The topic of today's session, as it was highlighted by Susan, is a continuation of the previous one, as we will dive deeper into contractual structure, rights, and obligation in infrastructure projects, and understand how corruption can thrive in any cycle of infrastructure projects. So last but not least, in the last session, we had a lively discussion with many questions and useful comments. Today, we will have more time for interaction. I encourage you to ask questions and to send them through the Q&A box. We will try to answer them at the end of the presentations, especially those who feel able to make meaningful contribution. They are welcome to be as a panelist. So we can accommodate up to 3 or 4 panelists who will speak for no more than 4 minutes. Please send your questions and send your request if you want to participate as a panelist to Susan, and we will invite you to share your comments with all participants. Now, over to you, Neill, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction, and Kamel for your introduction to this very important and interesting series of workshops, I hope. And so this is, as Susan and Kamel mentioned, workshop 2 in the first suite. So I'll share my screen. Can you see my screen up ahead of you, Kamel? There? You can. Thank you, Susan. So
yeah, we can see. Yes.
Thank you. Perfect. As Susan and Kamel mentioned, this is workshop number 2 in the suite of 8 workshops, which forms part of the first suite. The first workshop was last 2 weeks ago on why construction projects are prone to corruption, and we talked about all the various unique aspects of a construction project which can make corruption quite easy to take place in the project and quite difficult to understand. And this workshop today is the second introductory workshop, which looks specifically at the contract documents and the rights and obligations. And then the further 6 workshops follow on from the 2 introductory workshops, and namely they look specifically at how corruption takes place in procurement, how it takes place in the construction phase, how to prevent it in procurement, how to prevent it in construction, and finally how to investigate it in both those phases. So these 2 initial workshops are very much the background introduction, which enable you to understand how it takes place and therefore how to prevent it and how to investigate it. And basically, the contractual structure is hugely important to understanding, preventing, and investigating corruption, because it is within this complex structure, within these documents, which you see on construction projects, that a lot of corruption can be hidden. And corrupt organizations, corrupt individuals use these documents. They use the structure to their own advantage, and they conceal the corrupt acts in the structure and documentation. And if you are an investigator or a manager trying to prevent it, you may have great difficulty finding your way through to the actual corrupt act. So that's why today we're going to look specifically at how this all works. So we look today at the most common types of contractual structure and rights and obligations which are relevant to the construction of infrastructure projects. As we know, which is why we're here, corruption can frequently take place in the construction of infrastructure projects. And this corruption is facilitated and concealed by this structure and this documentation. So it's vital that you understand how this works. Now, contract documents vary significantly between projects. So we're not going to look at this workshop just at one specific type of contract. We're going to look at general common principles which apply throughout the construction sector worldwide. And these common principles are normally encapsulated in contracts, which are slightly different, but normally have these same common themes in place. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this workshop is part of an integrated sequence of workshops, and the later ones will build on what you learned today to help you understand how the corruption takes place, how to prevent it, and how to investigate it. So today we're going to look at these following specific aspects of the contractual structure. Firstly, we're going to look at the participants involved in the project. And I think for many of you on the workshop today, this will be very familiar to you, but hopefully there'll be some aspects which are new or revealing. If you're not familiar with the construction sector, then a lot of this will be quite new to you. But basically, the participants involved in the project, who are they? What role do they play? We're going to look at those in section 1. Then we're going to look at different types of contracts, which vary according to price structure, and how changes take place to the price, and what obligations flow from that. Then we're going to look at the contractual structure itself. Then we're going to look under 4 at specific documentation in a construction project, the general conditions of contract, special conditions, bills of quantities, etc. And then 5, we're going to look at specific activities on the project, like measurement of work, work approvals, payments, variations, delays, etc., and understand how these are impacted on by the documentation, and how they can help result in corruption. And then we conclude and have a discussion. Now, it'll be the next 2 workshops after this one, which will specifically give examples of specific types of corruption which take place using the documentation and using the unique aspects of a project. So we're not going to look today at specific types of corruption. Today we're learning about the documentation and structure which facilitates that corruption. The next 2 workshops will look at the actual corruption itself. So let's look firstly at the participants involved in the project. So who are the common project participants in an infrastructure project? Of course, projects can be extremely large, or they can be very, very small. But on most projects of any realistic size, you normally have a series of different participants involved. You have the project owner, which is the term we give to the organization which owns or controls the project. So in the public sector, that could be a public agency, and the private sector could be a bank or a company. And then we look at the contractor, the funder, consultant, subcontractor, and supplier. And we look at them each in turn and what their role is. These participants could be individuals, or they could be organizations. Much more likely on larger projects that these participants are organizations with a lot of employees. But on a very small project, these participants could theoretically be individuals. And also there could be more than one type of each participant. It's not the case that project has one contractor, one guarantor, one consultant. You could have several different organizations playing a similar role, but with slightly different contractual obligations. So let's go through them one by one. The project owner, as I started explaining earlier, is the owner of the project. They contract with the other project participants in order to have the project designed and constructed. The project owner can be known by different titles, such as the employer or the client. Depends on how the contract defines them by name. In the public sector, the project owner could, for example, be the Ministry of Roads, the road authority, which requires a public road to be constructed, or could be the Ministry of Finance, which requires an office block to be constructed for its personnel. The private sector, the project owner could be, for example, an oil and gas company requiring a drilling platform to be constructed, or property investment company requiring a shopping center to be constructed. So they ultimately own the project, they ultimately bear the final cost of the project, and they are the ultimate victim if the project is overpriced and corruptly built and therefore defective and unsafe. Although they are ultimately the victim, of course, the project owner can themselves perpetrate corruption, and their employees can perpetrate corruption. So they can be both the victim and the perpetrator of corruption, as is the case, in fact, with all the project participants. The project engineer is an organization or an individual normally appointed by the project owner to undertake management and measurement obligations in relation to the project. Not all projects have a project engineer, but commonly on large public sector projects, an engineer is appointed, sometimes called the project architect, sometimes called the engineer, sometimes called the project manager, a variety of reasons. but they're normally an organization or individual appointed to manage and measure in relation to the project. And this role could be undertaken by employees of the project owner. They could appoint their own people to manage the project and to measure. Frequently, they appoint an independent consulting engineer to undertake this role. And this role could include several different aspects. It could include designing the works, issuing variations to the scope of works or the program, granting extensions of time, calculating liquidated damages, measuring and certifying the amount of works undertaken and the amount of payment due to the contractor. So the engineer has a very important role, and often this role has a built-in conflict of interest, because if a public sector project owner appoints a third-party consultant to act as the project engineer, and they appoint them to be the designer of the project and to manage the project on behalf of the employer and to grant extension of time and certify work done, there can often be a conflict there, because the engineer may be designing the works and managing the works on behalf of the project owner, but when they certify extensions of time or certify the amount of work which has been done, they're meant to act independently as between the project owner and the contractor. They're meant to certify fairly and objectively how much work has been undertaken. So you can get situations where an error in the management or design of the engineer could lead to extra payments claimed from the contractor, which the engineer is meant to certify independently, but due to the conflict of interest, they may be reluctant to do so. So this role is a very complicated role, and in all the projects I've been involved in investigations on, the project engineer normally has some problematic role in the project I've been looking at. They have a very important position. And we'll look a little bit later in this workshop at some of the aspects that they deal with. The third organization involved is the contractor. That's the organization which enters into the contract with the project owner to construct the whole or part of the project. In some cases, the contractor undertakes all of the work under the contract itself, using its own personnel and its own equipment. In other cases, the contractor may only provide the management of the project using its resources, and it brings in, through subcontracts or supply contracts, all the personnel and equipment it needs to undertake the work. So those two cases are the extreme. The one case, the contractor undertaking everything itself with its own employees, and the other case where it's just a management contractor and it's contracting through subcontracts or suppliers all the necessary works or services. But in most cases, it's normally somewhere in between. The contractor will do some of the work with its own resources and will subcontract part of the works to other companies and bring in supplies of materials and equipment from suppliers. So normally it's a bit of a mix between the two roles. But it's very important to understand that the contractor is not necessarily just one organization doing all the work. It could be an organization with a myriad of subcontractors and suppliers underneath it in a complex contractual chain. So that's the contractor who actually is undertaking the work. And there's nothing to stop a project owner on a large contract appointing 2 or 3 contractors to do parts of the work each. So you don't necessarily even have only one contractor on the contract site. The funders, guarantors, insurers are the organizations providing the money, guarantees, or insurance in relation to the project. So this could be, for example, the government providing state funding to a public sector road. It could be a bank lending money to the project. It could be investors purchasing shares in a project participant. It could be providers of insurance against damage to the works or against injury to employees or third parties or against professional negligence and the design and management functions. Or they could be organizations providing guarantees which make payments in the event that the guaranteed company fails to perform the obligations under the contract. So you normally have in a large project a very large number of financiers, guarantors, insurers involved in the project, and they have themselves an important role to play. Then you have consultants. Now, consultants Could be individuals, or again, could be organizations with lots of employees. And they tend to provide services of a specialist nature to any of the other parties on the project. So they could provide these services to the project owner, or to a contractor, or to a subcontractor, or to a supplier, to anyone involved in the project. And they provide specialist advice and services. For example, project management services, or they may undertake the architectural or structural design. They may prepare detailed mechanical, electrical layout drawings. They may provide legal, financial, insurance, or tax advice or services. And so there could be a large number of different consultants on a project providing specific different types of advice and services. And as I touched on a few slides before, one of the most common forms of consultants to be appointed on a large construction project is where the project owner appoints a consulting engineering firm to provide the services as project engineer, as I referred to earlier. So that project engineer is a consultant, but they're providing specific management and design services. Then you normally have a large number of subcontractors, and they enter into a contract with the contractor to provide parts of the work or services contracted to the contractor. So they are normally appointed because they have a specific skill in relation to the works. For example, they may have specific skills and equipment in relation to excavation and foundation works, or drainage works, or installation of mechanical and electrical equipment, such as lights, plumbing, and heating, or installation of building and roof cladding. So subcontractors tend to coalesce into certain different skills and professions of the type I referred to above. And they will enter into a contract with the contractor to undertake that specific part of works. In some cases, subcontractors then subcontract a smaller part of their works to a subcontractor, who in turn may subcontract a smaller part of the works to a subcontractor. So you can get a cascade of subcontractors going involved in the construction project. Suppliers is a term given to the organization which supplies equipment or materials to a project. So it's distinct from a subcontractor normally, in that the subcontractor actually undertakes part of the works on the project. It may actually erect the roof. It may excavate the foundations. They are actually doing work on site. A supplier does not do work on site. A supplier supplies the necessary equipment, people, and materials to allow the works to take place. So they could, for example, supply excavators, trucks, site office, generators, steel, concrete, bricks, insulation, light fittings, taps, air conditioners, etc. And so they will cumulatively supply all the equipment and materials to the contractor or the subcontractor or whoever they are contracted with. So those are the key types of organizations involved in the contract. And we'll come in a few slides' time to the actual structure into which these organizations fit. But I next want to look at the type of contracts which could be entered into between the project owner and the contractor. Most contracts tend to follow the model of the project owner at the top, who could be public sector or private sector, as I mentioned. And then they mostly will have one contractor that they appoint, who they call the main contractor or the prime contractor. And then below that cascades all the subcontractors and suppliers. In that type of situation, that's called the main contract, and that contract is always the first port of call that you'll be looking at when you investigate or managing a project contract, because that specifies the entire obligations in respect of the whole contract. Different types of contract can be adopted between the project owner and contractor, and this normally depends on a combination of the price structure which they want to follow and the obligation structure that they want to follow. And so you do get very, very significant differences in contracts according to what type of price structure and obligation structure have been adopted by the project owner. It's normally the project owner's choice as to what type of contract that they enter into. So How do contracts vary according to price structure? There are three most common types of price structure adopted in a main construction contract. The first type is fixed price. This is when the contractor undertakes all the work specified in the contract for a fixed price. So in that situation, you need a very, very clear scope of work. You need a very clear design so that the contractor understands at time of tender exactly the quantity of work they have to undertake, what the design is that they're building to, and what the time scale is they have to build, and what the location is. So if they understand all the key parameters, then they're able to give a fixed price, which is a price which will not change, regardless of how much work is involved in the contract. That is subject to an exception, which I'll talk about a bit later, which is a variation, which is where the project owner changes or delays the work. That is the only situation normally when a fixed price contract can change its price. But normally, if the project owner leaves the contractor be to get on with the work, and that project owner does not change the design, there's no problem with the timings allowed by the project owner. The contractor has to work to that fixed price. The second main type of contract is called a remeasurement contract. And this is where the contractor undertakes specified types of work at fixed unit rates as specified in a contract bill of quantities. And I'll explain that a bit later. And then the final price is calculated based on the actual quantities of work undertaken, multiplied by the relevant unit rates. So I will describe the bill of quantities later, but simply how it works is that the project owner gives the contractor a sheet, a bill of quantities, which states an estimated quantity of all the different items of work which are going to take place in the contract. And then the contractor builds to the design. And however much they use, however much steel, however much concrete, etc., they finally use is finally measured and calculated according to the bill. So the work you do is remeasured at the end of the contract based on the actual work that you did. The third major type is the cost plus contracts, where the contractor works on an open book basis. They bring in suppliers, subcontractors on an open book basis. Project owner is always involved and observes the process, can see all the documentation, and the contractor charges the project owner the exact amount of work payment it pays to its supplier and subcontractors, plus an agreed percentage for overhead and profits, sometimes called an open book basis. I won't go into detail now, but there are very good reasons for these different types of contracts, and they are normally placed in different situations. For example, if you have a very certain scope of work, such as a building with a fixed design, it's normally better to go with a fixed price contract, because then everyone is certain what it's going to cost. The project owner has certainty of price, and the contractor has certainty. But where the work is uncertain, which is often the case in a road project or foundation or excavation, when you don't know the ground conditions, are you going to hit rock? Are you going to hit marine clay? What are you going to hit? You're not entirely sure. And often then it's better to go on a remeasurement contract because no one is quite certain what the final work's going to involve. So there are different reasons, advantages and disadvantages for the different price structures there. Now, the total price for a fixed price contract and the unit rates, the remeasurement contract, normally only change in very specified circumstances. And this is like a red flag alert for future workshops. Changes to the price of a fixed price contract and changes to unit rates in the remeasurement contract are, in my experience of many years investigation, one of the most common and easily concealed forms of corruption, because it's very complicated, these price calculation mechanisms, hundreds of pages of documents, technical details, drawings, designs, etc. You can hide a lot of corruption in changes to a fixed price contract and to the unit rates and the remeasurement contract. So normally I would recommend to investigators on a major project, home in pretty quickly on to changes to the price and changes, and look at the unit rates and calculations in the remeasurement contract, and in particular look at the excavation measurement. That's, again, for a later workshop. But the key point is the price should not change on a fixed price contract, or the unit rates should not change in a remeasurement contract, except in very specific circumstances. Now, a corrupt contractor and a corrupt project owner and a corrupt project engineer can manipulate these change reasons and therefore change the prices for corrupt reasons. So one of the reasons is if the project owner or the project engineer acting on behalf of the project owner changes the contract obligations. So if, for example, the contractor has to build a road which is 5 meters wide and 10 kilometers long, obviously, if that is a fixed price contract, obviously, if the project owner says to the contractor, oh, sorry, please make the road 5.5 meters wide, there must be a mechanism by which the contractor can increase its price to take account of the extra half a meter. So it's totally logical that if the project owner or engineer changes the design or changes the obligation, the contractor should be entitled to a price increase. But it's hugely important what the contract clause says about the entitlement to a price increase, because therein can lie the corruption. So the contract is normally very specific about how the price increase calculation is undertaken. So that's a variation, a change to the obligations. And the price should increase or critically decrease, which is another little corruption trick. The decrease mechanism may be eliminated from the contract conditions or may be ignored in the measurement when the price actually goes down on a variation. In the case of a remeasurement contract, there is normally an allowance to the contractor to increase or consequently decrease the price if the actual quantities vary by a specific percentage from the estimated quantities. This makes total sense, because if you're a contractor bidding for a contract and they say the estimated excavation quantities are 100,000 cubic meters, you will make an allowance for the mobilization of a specific amount of plant to carry out 100,000 cubic meters of excavation in a given time, and an allowance to demobilize that. And you have to put all your costs of equipment working, mobilization, demobilization, repair, maintenance, fuel, etc., into a unit rate per cubic meter. So you will quote as a contractor that you will do every cubic meter for, say, $20 a cubic meter. That unit rate is broken down, is based on a build-up, of all your core price components. It's if suddenly the project owner takes most of the 300,000 cubic meters out and leaves only 1,000 cubic meters in, you as a contractor are going to lose money on your rate, because your rate was a very cheap competitive rate based on very large volume of equipment working for a long period of time, 8 hours a day. If that's changed to be a very short working period, you're not going to be able to cover your mobilization cost. So you have to, as a contractor, be able to increase the unit rates based on that change. And similarly, if you're asked as a contractor to supply 1,000 cubic meters of excavation in rock, you will put in quite a high unit rate because it's difficult excavation and there's not very much of it. You have to cover all your mobilization, demobilization in quite a small number of units. If that quantity increases to 300,000 cubic meters and maybe is not rock, you will make a massive profit on that rate, unless the project owner can require the rate to be readjusted downwards. So again, there is a classic corruption mechanism for concealment in changing the in the actual quantity of work being very different or much greater than the estimated quantity. So it's very important on a construction project how the unit rates are calculated and how they can be changed. And they should only change the unit rates if there's a change to quantities up or down. And that change is normally by a minimum percentage, because you don't want to change the rate if there's just 1 or 2% difference, because that's always going to be the case on a construction project. You only want to be able to change the rate when there's a very significant pricing difference, say 10, 15, 20%. The third cause of a change to price is delay to a project. This is critical because a contractor working on site has its equipment on site, its site overhead, head office overheads being allocated to the project. And so it's a very time-critical cost calculation. The longer you stay on a project as a contractor, the greater your overhead and site costs are going to be. So if the project is delayed, your cost as a contractor will go up. And often, conversely, if the project is shortened, your cost may go down, depending on whether you need to accelerate the project or not. So therefore, it's very important in a construction project to have a mechanism for price change if there's a delay to the project. And so what normally happens, and I'll talk about it in more detail later, is if the delay is the contractor's fault, the contractor has to bear the consequent costs of the delay and will have to pay the project owner damages for being late. If the delay is the project owner's fault, then the contractor is normally entitled to charge its delay cost and will not have to pay damages to the project owner for delay. So there can be a lot of corrupt actions, corrupt claims hidden in the delay calculations on a construction project. So those are the three critical areas where changes to the price can take place. And again, very important for project management, controlling corruption, very important for investigators. The second key difference in construction projects is obligation structure. I mentioned before the price structure, fixed, remeasurement, and cost plus. The obligation structure, there are three primary types of obligation. The first one is design and construct. This is the ultimate obligation on the contractor. This is where the project owner says to the contractor, you must please design the project and construct it. So the project owner supplies an outline design of the building they want or the road they want, but only conceptually what it's going to look like, perhaps the architectural design only, but the detailed design will not be carried out. And then the contractor has to undertake the entire detailed design, the actual dimensions of the structure, where the pipes, cables are going to go, depth of the trenches, everything else will be designed by the contractor. So the contractor is consequently responsible for the design outcome. If the design doesn't work, it's the contractor's fault. The contractor is responsible for the performance of its subcontractors and suppliers. If they are late, if they provide defective work, it's the contractor's fault. And ultimately, the contractor is responsible for the whole construction outcome. The road should work and not break up. The power station should generate the correct amount of power. It's the contractor's problem if it does not. So design and construct is normally sort of the ultimate obligation on the contractor. The slightly lesser one is construct only. This is where the project owner provides the contractor with the detailed design of the project. Then the contractor constructs the project to the detailed design. That means the project owner is responsible for design outcome, but the contractor retains responsibility for performance of its subcontractors and suppliers and for the construction outcome. Now, this, of course, you'll immediately see can lead to argument. And when there is argument on a construction site, that can lead to corruption. Because if there's a big dispute between parties as to responsibility and cost, then there's pressure on people to offer bribes to supervisors to sort the whole thing out, or to fraudulently inflate what you're claiming. So immediately you see there an interface between design and construction. The project owner does design, the contractor builds to that design. If something goes wrong, project owner says, you built it wrongly, contractor. Contractor says, no, we didn't. We built it properly. Your design, what was at fault? So room for a lot of dispute and argument. Manage only is where the project owner provides the contractor with the detailed design of the project. The contractor appoints subcontractors and suppliers, but appoints them on behalf of the project owner. It does not appoint the subcontractors and suppliers on its own behalf. The contractor is therefore only managing the project on behalf of the project owner. So the project owner retains responsibility for the design as it did it itself, and it also assumes responsibility for the subcontractors and suppliers because contractor is appointing them on behalf of the project owner. So all the contractor therefore is doing is managing the project, and the contractor is responsible for its management failure, and the project owner is responsible for design outcome, performance of subcontractors and suppliers, and the construction outcome. But again, there's room for dispute, because the project owner could say, contractor, you managed that inadequately, and the contractor will say, no, we didn't. It's the fault of the subcontractor, it's the fault of the designer. And in these disputes and arguments lies room for corrupt claims and corrupt settlements. So that's the obligation structure. So that's, what does the structure look like contractually? So we talked about the different participants in section 1, the project owner, contractor, subcontractors, suppliers, consultants, etc. They all enter into a series of contracts which define their rights and obligations. And this contractual structure is a tree, it's a chain of contracts, starting at the top with the project owner, and then going downwards to the contractor, and then further downwards to subcontractors and suppliers. But one of the many problems is that participants contract only with the organizations above and below them in the contractual chain. So you could have participants working side by side on a project with participants with whom they have no contractual relationship. And again, this can cause complications. So this slide on the next page shows a very simple structure, where at the top we have the project owner. The project owner places a main contract with a main contractor, and the main contractor then places, say, the civil works with a civil works subcontractor, building works with a building subcontractor, and the plant, mechanical and electrical works with a plant subcontractor. They in turn, subcontractors, place supply contracts with suppliers, and they may even place subcontracts. For example, the building subcontractor may place a roofing subcontract with a roofing subcontractor. But that's a very simple contract chain there. In practice, you may have more than one contractor. It's possible if the project owner divides the work up into separate pots at the top level, or the main contractor may have more than 3 subcontractors, and those subcontractors may have subcontractors and subcontractors and so on. So there could actually be easily 100 organizations in that contract chain. And then separately, the project owner will place a contract with a project funder, perhaps a bank, to lend money for the project, an insurance company or more than one to insure the project. Then they may place a contract, as I mentioned earlier, with a project engineer to design and manage the project. And then they may, when the works are finished, place a contract with an operating contractor. And so you can imagine there that every chain in that contract is a potential contractual corruption interface. Every contract placed is a potential, allows potential bribery for the procurement. You know, the person bidding for the contract bribes the procurement manager, pays a bribe to get confidential information. There could be cartels between bidders, and there's more than one bid there. You know, on that contract you're showing about, sorry, that tree you're showing about 13. But if you have about 100 contractual links, there are 100 opportunities for cartels, 100 opportunities for bribes to be paid to procurement managers to corruptly win the contract. And then when the contract is actually placed and the works are undertaken, every contractual link is for work and for payment. And so therefore, every subcontractor providing bits and pieces of the work will provide the work on site. There'll be a supervisor checking the work on site, certifying the work. The subcontractor then is putting payment claim in to the contractor for payment. Someone has to approve their payment claim. Someone has to approve their payment. And all these links for approval of work done, for testing, for certification, for payments are happening on every one of those 100 contractual links from top to bottom in the contract. It's a minefield. It's a cascade of corruption opportunities from top to bottom. And bearing in mind, then in addition, you have the added complication I've just described of the different project structures. Each of the contractors there may have slightly different structures. You know, the main contractor may have been placed on a fixed price design and build contract there. And then there may be major variations and changes to that, enabling the main contractor to claim against the project owner. There may be massive delays by the civil works subcontractor, and the main contractor may be claiming against the civil works contractor under the civil works subcontract for delay. The civil works subcontractor may be blaming the building contractor for the delay, that the building contractor interfered somehow with the civil works. So you have cross claims between different parties, and you have claims between different parties with no contractual relationship. So the civil works contractor is claiming against the main contractor on the basis of delays caused to it by the building subcontractor, which has a separate contract with the main contractor. So basically, you can see here the incredible complexity of contract projects and how easy it therefore becomes to hide corruption in claims, corruption in variations, corruption in changes to the price, blaming people for problems they were not responsible for. And how on earth do you dig deep into this contract structure and actually solve the problem? And this, to my mind, is one of the key reasons when you accumulate it with the facts we talked about 2 weeks ago, the other unique factors, which makes construction projects a real opportunity for corrupt actors to make wrongful profits. And it makes it phenomenally difficult for project owners, assuming they're wanting to act non-corruptly, makes it very difficult for them to monitor and manage. And it makes it very difficult for investigators to investigate. Now, to make it even more complex, let's look at the conditions of contract. And it's important to understand these because although I have expressed how difficult it is to investigate a project and how easy it is to hide corruption, it is possible to investigate. It is possible to prevent. And when we get to the later workshops on prevention and investigation, I'm going to give a lot of very specific pointers as to how these corrupt activities can be prevented. And critically, if you're investigating them, how you can look for them, how you can find them, how you can dig deep. So it's by no means lost. It's by no means forlorn. It can be done. It's difficult, but it's critical that you understand how all this takes place. It's critical that investigators understand it. So what are these contracts? Because unless you understand this, you won't be able to prevent and investigate effectively. Firstly, they're the general conditions of contract. This is normally the master contract document. It specifies the core contractual rights and obligations of the parties. It's normally 100, 150, 200 pages long often, and it's very detailed. It's pretty headachy stuff to read. But it talks about how the works have to be carried out, how they can be approved, how the price is calculated, how payments should be made, when it should be made. Critically, how variations to the contracts may be instructed, how they should be valued, how changes and delays to the contract program are instructed and valued and dealt with, what the role and powers of the project engineer are, and legal and arbitration mechanisms. So this contract general conditions contains all the core rights and obligations which apply pretty broadly across most construction projects. Often these general conditions are a standard form document published by an international institution such as JCT, NEC, or FIDIC. And they are normally left intact, but often lawyers play with them and mess with them and put in schedules of changes, which makes life very, very difficult because different lawyers make different changes to conditions, but they're meant to be retained as a standalone general conditions of contract. Then the special conditions of contract is the separate document by which you can amend or add to the general conditions of contract. Sometimes these amendments or additions are good, often they are a mess, and lawyers make amendments to the general conditions without understanding what they're doing. So special conditions are often a horror story in my experience. But if you are going to amend the general conditions, it's normally amended in the special conditions. The general conditions normally stay as an intact, unchanged document, and they're amended by cross-reference in the special conditions. But the special conditions also have a valuable role in that they fill in gaps which are deliberately left in the general conditions. For example, how much damages should there be for delay. The delay provisions are incorporated in the general conditions, but the specific amount of the damages will be contained in the special conditions. If the general conditions say that a bill of quantities rate will be adjusted over a certain percentage, then the actual percentage applicable will normally be contained in the special conditions. If the general conditions allow the contractor to add overheads to their claim for work, then the actual overhead figure will normally be included in the special conditions. So the special conditions are an extremely important document to read in conjunction with the general conditions. The bill of quantities I touched on earlier. It's a hugely important document, particularly in civil works contracts such as roads. It's used in a remeasurement contract, and it's a very long, complex spreadsheet. And it'll state on the left of the spreadsheet all the different items of work which the contractor needs to undertake. And it can be very, very specific on certain contracts. So it may have excavation as the topic. Then it may have excavation in rock, excavation in marine clay, general excavation. It may have all sorts of different excavation types. And then next to that type of excavation, it will have an estimated quantity of the work which the initial design estimates the contractor will need to undertake. The contractor needs that estimated quantity to know what its unit rate should be. Then the third item will be the contractor's unit rate. So the contractor is given a sheet with the two left-hand items, the item of work and the estimated quantity. And the contractor then fills in the third column, which is its rate for each item. And this schedule can go on for pages and pages and pages. It can list drains, steels, culverts, foundation works, steel works, lights, fittings. Everything can be listed in the bill of quantities with the item of work and the quantity, then the price. Then the contractor will tender with its bill of quantities, and the project owner will assess all the competing tenderers' bill of quantities against each other and will work out which contractor is cheapest based on the aggregation of all their rates for all the items of work. This bill of quantities then becomes the master progress document on site. It's vital it's kept updated and filled in correctly. It's updated normally monthly, sometimes weekly, to show the actual quantities of work undertaken by the contractor to date. So the spreadsheet then grows to the right. So every month or every week or every day, even on a very detailed project, the quantity undertaken by the contractor in that period against each item of work will be entered into the bill of quantity. And the bill of quantities has to be approved by the contractor and by the project engineer on the project owner's behalf. And so it's very, very important documents because particularly in excavation, where sometimes once you've covered over the works, you're not sure how much excavation has been done. It's critical that the amount of excavation is calculated correctly and correctly entered into the bill of quantities. Then normally monthly, the bill of quantities will be submitted to the project owner for payment monthly as a progress payment, and the project owner will pay each month's progress according to the measurements of work done on the bill of quantities. Then at completion of the project, a final bill of quantities is calculated and the contractor is paid any balance due in accordance with the final bill of quantities. So it's a hugely, hugely important document. And in that document can lie so much room for corruption. There could be changes to the rates from the tender rates, which are slipped into the bill of quantities, and unless you cross-check the rates with contract rates, you may not spot the rate has been changed. The rate may be changed by variation. Then there's the question of whether it was validly changed with a valid variation, and whether the rate was accurately recalculated. There may be calculation problems in that the multiplication may be simply wrong, deliberately or accidentally. And there could be quantity issues in that the quantities put in by the contractor could be fake. And so therefore this is the ultimate document for manipulation on a corrupt civil works contract. So very important that that is managed very clearly, very carefully, and monitored and investigated. The technical specification is the document which provides the detailed technical requirements in relation to the contract works. For example, it will tell the contractor what the required ground conditions are at foundation base, what the required dimensions of materials and equipment are, such as steel thickness or ducting width, any performance characteristics of materials, such as concrete strength, air conditioning output, what types of fittings, lights, taps, etc., and what testing requirements are in place for the equipment and materials. So the contractor must do the work in accordance with the technical specification. And of course, this again is a classic case of allowing corruption, because the contractor can deliberately not comply with the technical specification and save a lot of money. For example, if the technical specification requires contractor to excavate down to -2 meters for the foundation base, and it's a large foundation area. If the contractor only excavates down to 1.8 meters, not to 2, it saves 200 mils of excavation, which saves it equipment time, labor time. It also saves it having to remove the excavation material from site using trucks, and also having to pay somewhere to take the removed material. It also means you've only got 1.8 meters of depth to put concrete and steel reinforcement in, rather than 2 meters. So playing around with the technical specification, particularly in relation to groundworks, can be a massive cost cheating / cost saving mechanism for the contractor. So a hugely important document to ensure compliance with the technical specification. The drawings, they actually are the drawings which will either be outline or detailed according to the type of contract. For example, you may have an outline drawing just showing the dimensions of the building being constructed, or you may have, and the outline drawing may just show the location of specific parts of the work in outline. But then you also have detailed drawings showing exactly where the air conditioning ducts are going, where the lighting cables are going, where the water pipes are going. So you do have a combination of outline and detailed drawings. And the contractor, again, has to comply exactly with the work as required by the drawings. So that's the contractual documents. Let's now put them all together and look at how these documents and how the participants interfacing create the key problems on a construction project. And they're normally a few very core obligations in a construction project where it's normal that all problems coalesce around. So as I said, construction contracts are complex. They run to hundreds of pages. The main contract normally contains all the rights and obligations of the parties in relation to the whole project. And as I mentioned before, there are differences in the contractual rights and obligations according to the pricing structure agreed, the primary obligations agreed, the type of general conditions adopted, what's said in the special conditions, and also what's contained in all the other contract documents, such as the technical specification, drawings, and bill of quantities. So it's very rare for a contract to be the same as between one contract and another, one project and another. They're normally quite significant differences. But if the contractor appoints subcontractors for parts of the project, it's important that the contractor actually ensures that the subcontractor is actually undertaking the works in accordance with the obligations of the main contractor. So this gives the main contractor a bit of a problem, because the main contractor signed a main contractor with hundreds of pages of contract conditions, special conditions, drawings, technical specification, bills of quantities. They've got literally thousands of pages of documents, but now they are breaking the works up into sub parts, and they've got to make sure that each of their subcontractors exactly complies with that part. They can't just give the whole contract to the subcontractors, because the subcontractor will get swamped. So they have to break the documents up to the component parts and ensure that the subcontractor is actually complying with the obligations which the main contractor has to comply with in relation to that part of the contract works. This is complicated, and they normally try as far as possible to mirror the obligations of the main contract as far as reasonable in the subcontract documents. But this whole passing on of obligations down between subcontractors, subcontractors becomes immensely complicated because of the complexity of the documentation. So what are these key obligations which the project owner and the contractor are trying to make sure is mirrored throughout the contract? Measurement is probably at the heart of a construction project, particularly a civil works project. The accurate measurement of work done is of fundamental importance. I mean, firstly, it's important because you've got to ensure that the works are being undertaken in accordance with the contract requirements. That if the design says the foundations are to a certain depth, the road is to a certain width, the building is to certain dimensions, there's a design reason for that. And therefore you should measure always the work done to make sure that the work has been done properly in accordance with the design and the drawings. But in addition, measurement's important on a remeasurement contract because the amount paid to the contractor depends on the measurement of work actually done on the site each day. Even if the contract's a fixed price contract, as between the project owner and the contractor, there'll be remeasurement issues down the subcontract chain because the contractor will probably be paying the subcontractors and suppliers based on a measurement basis, even if the contractor is paid on a fixed price basis. So measurement is at the heart of every construction contract. To ensure accuracy and reduce corruption risk, measurement should normally be undertaken by both the contractor and by the project owner or the project engineer on behalf of the project owner. That, of course, is at the top level. The subcontract level, then the measurement should be done by the subcontractor and by the contractor, and so on down the contract chain. But normally you want measurement being done by both parties involved in the project. At top level, the measurement's normally done by someone skilled in the task, such as a quantity surveyor. How is it measured? The technical specification will normally specify the measurement arrangements for each different type of work which is undertaken. It normally depends on what the type of work is. Excavation and fill is probably one of the most complex for measurement, and that can be done simplistically by taking detailed ground level readings before and after excavation and fill. The difference in levels is the amount excavated or filled. That's critical there. There's a distinction between excavation and fill. From the point of view of corruption and the bill of quantities, it's very critical because, of course, when you excavate, you are removing material and creating a hole effectively. And there's a cost to that. There's a cost to the equipment, excavating, the men, the labor, and there's normally a cost to removing that excavation from site or moving it somewhere else. But often that hole has to be filled with something, and therefore material has to be brought in. And the material, be it concrete or aggregate, whatever it is, has to be purchased and has to be filled and compacted in the hole. So therefore, you've got two major activities there, excavation and fill. And so therefore, you must have measurement for both these activities. And a contractor, as I mentioned earlier, could shortcut on both the excavation and consequently on the fill. So if you don't take your proper ground level readings after the excavation and you fill in, how do you know how much is there? Because no one took the reading of what the level was you excavated to. So it's absolutely critical that the site is monitored and measurement takes place at all critical moments. Another way of either double checking or primary measurement is to measure the volume of material delivered to or removed from site, such as by truck delivery records or quarry loading records. What we normally do in an investigation is cross-check the records of excavation and fill and the delivery records to try and ascertain that there's a approximate comparability between them. For building construction, the measurement may be easier if you can see what you're measuring. You may measure the building dimensions upon completion stages, or again, you may measure volume of material delivered to site. But if it's something like pipes, lights, taps, air conditioning units, you can actually see them. So it's much easier to count them in that case once they're installed. Your most problematic measurement items from a corruption perspective are the ones which are being concealed. steel being concealed under concrete, foundations being concealed under concrete, roofing, insulation or waterproofing being concealed under cladding. Those are your critical items to be checked and measured before they're concealed. Work approval and payment is another critical aspect on the site. The contractor normally applies periodically, monthly or by stages or milestones for approval of and payment for the work undertaken in that period. How they do it, the contractor applies in the payment application, which is a critically important document. The payment application is normally a monthly document, can be more frequent or less frequent. In that document, the contractor will state the work undertaken in that period. If there's a bill of quantities, it'll be by reference to the bill of quantities, or will normally attach the bill of quantities, and it'll aggregate the quantities done in that period. And then the payment application values the amount of work done in accordance with the contract valuation method by reference to the BOQ, for example, or by the other measurements requirements. And normally you require proof to be done, to be attached to the application. Of course, now it's mainly electronic, not manual, but the proof of work done, the delivery records, the photos, the timesheets, the quality test certificates should all be made available by the contractor alongside the payment application, so that the project engineer can verify the payment application and the project owner can be satisfied the work is done, and that then it's available also for auditing later. So once the payment certificate has been prepared, and I just see a hand raised there, we're going to take questions at the end. So all questions, if you could just hold them, sorry about that, till the end. There'll be plenty of time for questions. The contractor submits the payment application to the project engineer, if there is one. The project engineer then has the role of independently and objectively calculating the work done by the contractor and signing it as done, or correcting it if the engineer feels there's a mistake. So once the project engineer has verified and corrected as appropriate the payment application, project engineer then issues a document called the payment certificate. And the payment certificate is signed by the engineer, attaches the contractor's payment application, and it goes to the project owner and says, please pay the contractor this amount of work for the work done in this period. And under most construction contracts, the project engineer's role is meant to be objective and provisionally binding. That's quite important. So once the project owner receives the payment certificate from the project engineer, the project owner is meant to pay the contractor the full amount on the payment certificate, even if the project owner is not happy with the certification. What happens then is that the certificate is sent to arbitration by the project owner. So if the contractor applies to the project owner, if the contractor applies for a payment application, gives it to the project engineer, if the engineer reduces the amount on the payment certificate and says, I don't believe you, contractor, you haven't done all that work, I'm deducting 10% off it, there's nothing the contractor can do. They have to keep working, but they can submit that payment application to arbitration. If, on the other hand, the project engineer gives a payment to the project owner, and the project owner says, I'm not happy with the payment, it's too high, the project owner has to pay the contractor and submit the dispute to arbitration. So the key here is that project is meant to keep going, cash flow is meant to keep coming from the project owner to the contractor. The project engineer is meant to act as an impartial certifier, and they can all argue it out at arbitration as the project goes along or at the end of it. That's how it's meant to work. But of course, coming back to the corruption issue, if the contractor has paid money, a bribe to the project engineer may inflate the cost of the certificates or approve an inflated application. Conversely, if the project engineer feels it owes something to the project owner because the project owner is paying it as a consultant, the project engineer may be inclined to drop the payment application of the contractor and approve less than the contractor has applied for, just to keep the project owner happy. So there's a significant conflict of interest I mentioned before, which is a corrupt conflict of interest if the project engineer acts corruptly. If they handle the conflict of interest and act objectively, it's fine. But if they don't act objectively, it's corrupt, and they can be liable for bribery or for fraud. And as I mentioned then, once the project owner has got the payment certificate, they must pay the contractor the amount shown on the certificate. If they aren't happy, it goes to the arbitration process. And similarly, the contractor can apply to the arbitration process if they're unhappy. All the payment certificates and applications while the project is proceeding are called interim. And then the final version at the end of the project is called final. And once the final certificate is issued, then payments are closed and the project is over. Variations are absolutely fundamental. And again, a lot of corruption can be hidden in variations. It's even if the design is complete and the project owner has given the contractor a fixed complete design to build to, it's very important that project owner can change the design, because they may make a mistake in the design and have to change it, or they may halfway through change their mind and want something different. So most contracts have a provision where the project engineer, acting on behalf of the project owner, can issue a variation or a change order, they're often called, to the contract. And that can change the dimensions of the building, they can change the materials, can change drainage layout, can change lighting design, can change the width of a road, can change anything. And if they do issue such a variation, it must be issued through the formal contract variation process. And this will normally result in an adjustment to the contractor's price and the time the contractor has to complete the works. So if the variation is going to take the contractor longer, then the contractor should be given more time. If the variation is going to speed the works up, the contractor will be given less time. And this has an impact on the project price. If the amount of equipment and materials being used goes up or down, that has an impact on the price. So there's a procedure in the contract to adjust the price and the timing. Delay, the contract normally provides a fixed time for the contractor to complete the works. Normally what happens is if the contractor is delayed in completing the works, the consequences depend on the type of delay and the type of contract. Commonly, if the delay is the fault of the project owner or the engineer, the contractor is not responsible. So they will be entitled to charge additional costs caused by the delay, such as their extra equipment on site, extra overheads, etc. And they'll be entitled to an extension of time to complete the works. So the program is formally extended by the amount of the delay. And as a result, the contractor does not have to pay damages to the project owner for late completion, because the fact the project is delayed is not the fault of the contractor. On the other hand, if the delay is the fault of the contractor is not entitled to charge additional costs for the delay and is not entitled to an extension of time to complete the works. And therefore, the contractor has to pay the project owner damages for late completion. This, as you can see, is an enormous potential cost swing. For the contractor, on the one hand, if they can blame the project owner, they don't pay damages for delay and they get their costs or additional costs on site. But if it's their fault, they pay damages for delay and they do not get their costs on site. So it's a massive consequential swing to the contractor. In delay claims, therefore, lays huge disputes, because most contracts are delayed for whatever reason, and most contracts end up in dispute as to who is responsible for that delay. And the reason for that is because of the enormous cost swing caused by the delay damage and extra cost provisions in the contract. So obviously, this is a real home for corruption, because if the contractor is acting corruptly, they will manipulate their records and lie and state that the delay is the fault of the project engineer or the project owner, and they'll conceal adverse documentation. So if the delay is their subcontractor's fault, the contractor will conceal documentation from the project owner, which reveals it's the subcontractor's fault, and will pretend it's the project owner's fault. So that is fraud, because they're fraudulently claiming money which they should not be claiming, and they're fraudulently withholding documents and fraudulently inflating claims. But project owner, likewise, could be acting corruptly. Because if the contractor legitimately was delayed by the project owner, it's the project owner's fault. The project owner may not want to pay extra compensation for delay. It may not want to lose the liquidated damages. So the project owner staff could do the exact opposite. They could hide documentation, manipulate documentation, and blame the contractor for the delay, even if it's the project owner's fault. And likewise, the project engineer, if it's their fault, the delay, because they messed up the design, the project engineer may manipulate documentation and lie about the true cause of the delay. So you have a massive opportunity here for fraud, and of course, inevitably for bribery, because if the contractor is trying to push its claim through and the project owner representative indicates they may be happy to accept the claim for a personal payment, you then have a bribery interface. Or if the project engineer agrees it'll certify the delay for a personal payment, you have a bribery interface. So the whole issue of variations and delay is a massive, massive pot of potential corruption. And as I mentioned before, the project engineer is conflicted. And this is a massive problem in the construction industry. They normally have a dual role: acts on behalf of the project owner in ensuring the contract is performing in accordance with the contract and approving work done and issuing variations. But they're meant to act independently as between the project owner and contractor in valuing work done, valuing variations, and calculating extensions of time. And it's very difficult for the project owner to act independently if it's conflicted. If it's either caused the problem itself through its own management of design problem, or if it's trying to keep the project owner happy because the project owner is paying the bill, the project engineer. So it's a very brave project engineer who defies the project owner by supporting the contractor because they may not get appointed on the next project. So it's an inherently conflicted role, which leads to corruption in many, many cases. The contract also has general provisions, such which I won't get into here: the right of parties to terminate and claim damages for breach of contract, obligations not to behave corruptly, a dispute resolution process, which could be court or arbitration. That will normally be contained in the general conditions of contract. So in conclusion, just looking at the overall structure, you have what is a massively complex issue here. You have a contract here where you have the different participants: the project owner, funders, guarantors, insurers, contractors, project engineer, subcontractors, subcontractors, suppliers, all acting together in a very complex contractual chain, which could involve 100 links. Every link is a potential for bribery or for fraud. And then you have immensely complicated documentation: the general conditions, the special conditions, bill of quantities, technical specification, the drawings, etc., which can conceal corrupt acts by clever manipulation of the wording. Then you have very complex contractual process involving measurement, measurement of work done, and the measurement leads to payment. And you have all sorts of issues with potential for the contract to be varied, which results in price changes and delays to the contract. You have the potential for the contractor to be delayed by the project owner or engineer. All this falls into a big, messy pot of potential fraud, potential bribery. And what normally happens is no one can quite work out what happened, because the contractor will say, not my fault, it was someone else's fault that this happened. If you spot an overcharge, the contractor will say, oh, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to overcharge. Sorry, it wasn't corrupt, it was a mistake. How can you break through that mess of documentation and mass of documentation and mass of people? How can you put controls in place to make this work smoothly and non-corruptly, bearing in mind all those corruption interfaces? And how can you investigate and find out the corruption if there has been corruption? It is possible. And then the next 6 workshops, we're going to look at how the corruption takes place, how to prevent it, and how to investigate it, because you can work through this highly complex mess and you can get to the bottom of it with proper determination, and you can, with the proper controls in place, prevent this happening at the beginning, which is frankly what we should be doing. It's far better to prevent this from happening with good controls than actually have to investigate it later. So thank you very much. It's rather heavy, headachy section, I'm afraid. I hope the future sessions are a bit more interesting than this, but happy to discuss and to take questions now. So thank you, Kamel.
Thank you very much, Neill, for this comprehensive presentation. Thank you for such an incredible insights about where corruption takes place and where the niches of corruption lie in the complex infrastructure projects. So there are a lot of questions. I have some questions also, but I will give priority to participants. But I will just start with one question to kick off the discussion, and then I will give the floor to the participant. And I have taken note of some question which I will give you just to answer. So briefly, my question is refers to slide 5 onwards, which is about the list of participants who are involved in the project. From my humble experience, there are some other players in infrastructure projects, and my question is, where do you see them in this landscape of participants involved? I will start by 3 or 4 of them. I have listed 3 or 4 which are not mentioned in your list. The first one is the sub-national authorities, particularly when the project is taking place in a municipality, in a region, in the sub-national levels. Usually, these authorities, they are involved from the design of the project, but they don't follow because they don't have the resource, they don't have this skilled engineers to participate and to contribute to the design. They appear when they start to see the project, when the project in the execution phase. So, and sometimes they require some addition or some change, which will result in some variation that you talked about, and variation are a niche for corruption. So sub-national authorities, they are not part of the contractor, they don't sign the contract, but they are the end beneficiaries, and so they have their own word in the execution of the project. Another player, I don't know, but this I think is different. We have, of course, the project owner, but we have what we call the delegated project owner, which is slightly different. I can give you just a simple example. If the state wants, the Ministry of Health wants to construct a big hospital, the Ministry of Health doesn't have the capacity, the technical capacity to handle such a project. So they will require the Ministry of Infrastructure to do it and to handle it of the technical. So we have 2 types of owner. We have the owner and we have the delegated project owner. Those participants who are familiar with the French literature about this, they know the word maître d'ouvrage délégué. So how do you see this? Because they are not the owner, but they are the real owner. But the owner who is handling the project is the ministry or the technical body, the institution which has the capacity to run the project. The third player is the building inspection agency. Is not, which is different from the consultant. There is a consultant, of course, but usually the state, when it wants to build a project, it will appoint a firm, a special firm, which will be in charge of the control of the project, of the control from the technical standpoint. It's not just a control about corruption or a control about execution, but the control from the technical to make sure that the contractor meets the technical specifications. And the fourth one is the designer. I don't see the designer among the list. The designer, of course, he's the initiator of the project because the designer will design the project, but he should be part of the execution because during the project, as you truly said, there will be some addition, some change in the project, and the designer, the initial designer, should be committed to redesign the project based on the last minute requirements, and sometimes it's a demand from the subnational authority who wanted to expand the project and to create sometimes, which will create sometimes some problems. So how do you see these players in the landscape that you have put the list of participants?
That's good point. On the last one, the designer I had in there as the project engineer doing the design, or the project owner doing the design internally. So I did cover that possibility, that the design being done by the project engineer. But you're right. What you're mentioning there is a much greater complexity than even I touched on. I just tried to take the most, perhaps a common, simple form of contract structure. And maybe I need to add another slide just to mention, as you've done, that it could be even more complex, because you could have the interface with all the other government departments, like fire and safety and other municipal authorities could be interfacing. And they're not part of the contract structure, as you mentioned, but they put requirements on which the contractor has to comply with. So you raise a very good point that the example I gave is perhaps one of the more simple forms of contractual structure, and it can get even more complicated, particularly with all the different authorities. And I think I'll add another slide just to mention that possible complexity, Kamel. You raise a good point. And then, of course, what happens is if the fire safety and other people claim that the design is not adequate to meet the design, and then the contractor claims that the design was done by the project owner and didn't include those fire requirements, then you have another argument. Who's responsible? Is the project owner responsible for the fire department or not? And yes, it's an added level of complexity. There's no doubt.
Okay, thank you. Let me come to the questions. I have a number of questions which has been asked by participants. The first one, I will take them in order. During the execution of infrastructure works and given the variation in prices, can the company request a revision of prices during the execution of works? In this case, the price will not be fixed. This question is asked by Mamoun Riqaya. Is it clear for you? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I've understood correctly, I think it just depends entirely on what the contract says. The contract conditions control the construction process, and if the contract conditions say you cannot have a variation except when the project owner issues a variation, full stop, that's it. You can't claim any other. But some contracts are more flexible, and some contracts do allow variations to take account of weather conditions or force majeure or other aspects like that. So I would say in normal situation, the basic legal rule is you give a price to build works to a certain design and specification. That's your price. If that changes, you should be entitled to a variation, because that's not what you contracted to do. But it depends entirely on the contract. And some contracts are very vague in their wording, and this causes all sorts of legal arguments and disputes between parties. So I think it's not possible to answer totally. I'd say it depends on the contract, it depends on the law. But contracts should be as specific as possible about when a variation should take place to avoid this ambiguity.
Thank you. Michael Avery has put some questions. I would ask if Mike, if he's here, perhaps to be promoted as a panelist, so he can share his question with all of us. Let me go to other questions, and then we will come back to Michael Avery. Michael Avery, who you should know, he's a member of the committee, and he's from United States and from the American Society of Civil Engineers. So please get ready to take the floor, Mike. Another question from Francisco Guzman. Don't you think it's a good way to manage project contracts to get a primary step between the project and the bid, to let future contractors to expose what they think it should be changed and at the project in order to get a better contract and avoid claims and over costs? Is that clear for you, Neill? Otherwise, I can, yeah.
I'm not sure I understood that question. Sorry, no, Kamel, yeah. Yeah.
Do you want me to read it again?
Yes, please, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it is a good way to manage projects, contracts, to get a primary step between the project and the bid, to let future contractors to expose what they think it should be changed at the project in order to get a better contract and avoid claims and overcosts?
I think I understand. Yes, if I've understood correctly, is that the type of contract process which is permitted by many public sector procurement rules, where the contractor forms part of the negotiation for the contract. If you have a concept for a project and you bring in contractors at an early stage before contract to try and eliminate problems, I think this is possible because if contractors can eliminate certain design issues and certain problems before the tenders are called for, then everyone is aware. But it's got to be done totally openly, totally transparently, because if you give one contractor the right to negotiate with the clients and get all this information and talk to them, then you put it out to public tender, and only that one contractor had the advantage. That gives them a huge advantage. So it has to be very carefully monitored. I think it's called competitive dialogue in the European Union procurement rules, this process. So I agree with the question. It's a good point. It is a good way sometimes to iron out problems in advance. But in my view, it doesn't stop corruption, because even if you iron out problems with the contract in advance, that doesn't mean the contractor is not necessarily going to take shortcuts on the work, trying to claim for delays, claim for extra cost when they're not entitled to. So it may eliminate some problems, but it doesn't eliminate the whole concept of corruption. For that, you still need your very good project controls and highly ethical contractors. But it can help. I take the point.
Another question. This is a comment by Francisco, but I don't think it's a question. It's just a comment to which you can consult in the Q&A questions. But I have another question from Gorbel. How can parties ensure compliance with environmental and regulatory obligations in the contractual structure of infrastructure projects? It's not about corruption, but it's about compliance with environmental regulation. Yeah.
I mean, how that normally will take place, in my experience, is that the compliance with environmental regulations applicable to that country will be incorporated as part of the contract obligation of the contractor. So the general or special conditions will state specifically, you must comply with all environmental regulations, and they may specify which regulations are to be complied with. And there may be specific parts of the technical specification which actually deal with environmental compliance, and the contractor may be asked to submit an environmental compliance method statement as part of its bid. So there are two issues here. One is compliance with the law, and one is compliance with the contract. If the environmental controls are part of the national law, the contractor has to comply with them full stop anyway as part of the law, and the law can be enforced against them if they don't. If they're part of the contract obligations, then the contractor has to comply with them as part of the contract obligations. So I would say they're normally incorporated as a contractual obligation.
I see Michael Avery is already promoted as a panelist, so I will deal with the two other questions, and we will go to the panelists. We have two Michael who will participate as a panelist. So another question is, are there artificial intelligence tools recommended for measuring? For example, using the camera of a tablet and an application may count the installed pipes.
Yeah, this is a very big, I know it's something very close to the heart of Mike Kramer, who's the panelist today, this measurement. And it's going to be dealt with quite explicitly in the workshops on preventing corruption and investigating corruption. I put a lot of emphasis on this type of measurement because basically, if you can have site controls with a gate and a site access and a camera, if you can record every truck in and every truck license plate, if you can record every employee in, the time they came in and out, if you can measure on site the number of linear meters of steel delivered by a truckload, all these things should be fed into the record. So as part of the construction record, all the delivery notes, the purchase subcontracts, the purchase invoices, the delivery records of the trucks, the daily site records of the site manager, the site photographs, the site gate records should be fed into a central record, which is available for auditing and checking. And I know Mike Kramer, I think, will have something to say on this, but we're scratching our heads hard how artificial intelligence could play a very significant role in this type, because if all the data from a site is fed into an AI, including photographs, the AI could actually check that everything is being delivered. So there's a lot of potential for verification using cameras, photographs, site records, etc. I will deal with that in my next workshops.
Yeah. Another question from Francisco. Who runs the certificate arbitrations? We have not that kind of arbitration in Argentina. It's interesting because we had at work anti-corruption expert at National Supreme Court of Justice Department detected overpayment, cross-checking, it's not clear for me, cross-checking them with photographs. Is that clear for you?
I'm not entirely sure, because I thought who does the arbitration? I thought was the question. Was it, or was it?
It's about arbitration. Anyway, we can come back to this. Yeah, we can come back again to this question. So let's go back now to the live participation, and we will start by Michael Avery. Yes, over to you, Michael. Can you put your camera? You are muted. Yes, can you mute yourself and put your camera? If you don't mind.
Yes. Hi. Can you see me? Okay.
Not
or
yet.
Hear me?
Not we can hear you, but not we cannot see you.
Okay. Well, let me try to keep it moving.
No problem.
So, Neill, thank you very much. Great oversight. I have a question about, you talked about many different interfaces between contractors, subcontractors, project owner, etc. A lot of interactions. From your experience, where is the interfaces that are highest risk? Where should we pay most attention to minimize corruption?
No, it's a good question, Michael. I would say certainly that the top interface is always the first port of call, and where I would always go first of all was to the main contract and the interface between the main contractor and the project owner. And I would look immediately at if it's a remeasurement contract, get hold of the bill of quantities and all the payment certificates and payment applications. And if there's no sort of whistleblower, anyone giving an indication, you look by way of sample at the sort of major high-risk activities in that. And I would always look at excavation and foundations as being a particular high-risk activity. And then, having looked at that main interface, I would then look down one level at the high-risk subcontract interfaces. And again, I'd probably pick out the excavation and foundations contractor, perhaps as one of the higher risk ones. And just do it by way of sample, because it's the top level where the most money is going to be at stake, because lower down the chain, you get smaller and smaller and smaller all the way down until right at the bottom of the chain, you may be talking a few $1,000s here or there. So, and all the money at the bottom gets accumulated, because every bill, every invoice from a subcontractor gets included in the next layer, and that gets included in the next layer and accumulated and gets marked up with their overhead and profits. So at the top level, you are getting all of the accumulated problems from low down. But so I would always start at the top and definitely go one layer down. And then if you discover something, you can then follow the chain all the way through.
Thank you. And a follow-up question. Some infrastructure projects are paid with loans from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. And for that loan, there would be a contract between the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the recipient country. So there's a contract there. Then the project owner, being the Ministry of Works, has a contract for the contractors. So could you talk about how the requirements of the loan agreement contract interacts with the grantee country who are hiring the contractors. If I didn't explain that well, please tell me, but there's that other level of contract, and how does that how does that play in this? Thanks.
No, it's a very good point, Michael. It's a very sort of, I know Michael Kramer will have something to say on that as well. But just from my point of view, it's a hugely important point, and one where the development banks and the aid agencies do not play a significantly broad role in our view. And we've tried with them before to try and persuade them to take a greater role. What we've found generally is that they play quite a significant role in the procurement. They actually put sort of a lot of procurement regulations down and say on this project there must be open competitive tendering, and the bank officials often look at the evaluation and see that they're happy with the way the procurement was carried out. Then they tend to walk away. And what we've said to them is, if you control the procurement, then the money's going to bleed out later. And it's going to bleed out a lot later. You've got to be watching it all the way through. So what we've said to the development agencies again and again and again is, you've got to either have your own monitoring or have an independent monitoring system on the project. So you should impose project controls, which are the ones I'll be talking about in a few weeks' time. You should actually make sure that there is an anti-corruption management system put in place on the project which you're financing. You must make sure that management system requires training for all project staff. You must have an auditing system in place on the project. You must make sure all those interfaces, the ones you just touched on, Michael, the key interfaces between for payments are actually sampled and monitored, that all the documentation is being kept. You need some independent reporting mechanism. You need all these controls in place. And the banks should really impose that as a condition of the loan. And they should also work with the recipient country to make sure that this is being effectively managed. And I'll hand over to Michael Kramer on this one now, because Mike knows a lot more than I do, having worked for the World Bank. But I don't know if that mirrors your views, Mike, that the banks turn a blind eye to what's happening during project implementation.
Yes, Neill. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting and useful presentation. And I have a couple of questions if we have time. But in response to the question about the World Bank, yes, I've worked with them as a consultant virtually every day for more than 20 years. And so I am familiar with their lending practices. Now, the bank is a development agency, but it does operate as a bank. In other words, it identifies what it thinks are useful development projects, useful infrastructure projects. And then it has a contract with the countries, but under these contracts, the bank delegates virtually all of the implementation requirements that you talked about and the oversight requirements. And they're very, very reluctant, at least in the past, to get involved themselves in oversight except in procurement and in supervising the construction works. And when a problem arises, the World Bank's not happy about it. If there are whistleblower complaints about corruption or fraud or overcharges, the bank will have only a few remedies. In other words, the bank has no jurisdiction. It has no authority in the borrower country. So all the bank can do is apply the World Bank's contract limitations, which will say, for example, if funds are misused, the bank can suspend the loan, the bank can debar a contractor, but beyond that, the bank can do very little. For example, if the bank receives information that local government officials are involved in the corruption, again, the bank has no authority to address that, has no authority to take any action against the government officials who are in a sovereign country. All they can do is send a letter to the implementing agency advising them of the complaints and asking the local officials to do something. So all of that means is that the World Bank and other lending agencies have very limited power and control as a practical measure over controlling corruption. Now, having said that, that's starting to change because the bank in particular is very concerned about the huge lending that's coming to control climate change risks and green infrastructure. So I think I mentioned this before. Literally trillions of dollars are going to be spent, tens of trillions of dollars are going to be spent in the next couple of decades, mostly on infrastructure projects to control the impact of climate change, which the bank thinks in many countries, particularly in Africa, could be devastating. And they are most concerned about how they can increase their supervision powers to prevent fraud and corruption in these projects. Because in the past, if World Bank funds were misused in the construction of a school or in the construction of a road, they didn't like that, but that wouldn't be devastating. That could be fixed later. But the bank thinks that if funds are misused in combating climate change, the results could be literally devastating in many countries. So now the bank is starting to talk about, at least, how can we improve oversight? How can we ensure, especially in corrupt regions of the world, independent, honest oversight? And it's a very complicated topic. The whole topic of how the World Bank manages projects is very, very important. Michael or any of our other participants, if you have an interest in this, certainly Michael Avery, I'd be delighted to provide you with more information about this and would look forward to doing so.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Neill. And Kamel, thank you. My questions were answered, so you can put my microphone on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your participation, Mike. Another question coming from Onas. In the step of choice of the contractor between others, and we have made a failure in the methodology of choice, what can we do in this case? And we are in the making of the evaluation report. Did you get this question, Neill, or perhaps I can guess? Yeah.
Sorry, did you say there's an error in the evaluation that they've made? Did you say?
No, in the methodology. Perhaps they made yeah. He's asking if I'm translating your. It's not. My translation is not faithful. Please, you can ask your question again, or you can take the floor. The person who asked this question, I think he's talking about in the selection phase, if the owner has made a failure, he failed to perhaps to put the appropriate methodology, and then based on that methodology, they selected the bidder. Then after that, they realized that it was not the best bidder, perhaps, and what can they do? What would be the solution? I think this, I guess this is what the intention behind this question, yeah.
I see, yeah. Well, that's a tricky one, because if you make an error in methodology, but you appoint a contractor and you sign a contract, you've got a contract with the contractor. And I don't see, unless there's been some corruption by the contractor, because then I don't see how you can do anything about it unless the contract allows termination. I mean, I'm a big fan that public sector contracts should allow termination of a contract at will by the project owner, but paying compensation for costs to date. I think that should be built into all public sector contracts, because then if the government makes a mistake, they can at least stop and say, sorry, terminate it, pay costs to date, because it's not the contractor's fault, and then start again. But very few contracts have that. Most contracts give a contract for the whole project, and you can't terminate it without paying huge damages. So I don't honestly know what they can do. It depends on the contract conditions. If it's just a mistake. If there's any corruption involved, most countries' laws allow you just to cut. Corruption tends to void all contracts in most legal systems. So as soon as you have corruption, the underlying contract which resulted from the corruption is void. You can stop it and start again. But if there's no corruption, you're bound by the terms of the contract.
Another question from this one from Amor, Sweden, from Tunisia. What do you think about low prices and quality of work and technical specification regarding corruption?
It's very difficult to know, because yeah, it's in the sense that a low price bidder can be a signal of corruption, because one of the common methods of corruption, if it's a competitive tender and there's a genuine tender in that the public sector says lowest price bidder will win, then there's a lot of pressure to bid very, very low, and then make arrangements with the project engineer or the project owner that you will get variations or delay payments, or you'll cheat on the work and therefore make your money later. So yes, there's a big worry about the efficacy of just giving prices to the lowest price. So there's a lot of talk nowadays and much more pressure on a best evaluated tender, where price is a factor, but also the quality of the contractor is a factor, et cetera, And also on a major projects, I'm a big fan of a pre-qualification exercise, where you have a pre-qualification, so only contractors with the best technical qualifications win. And then once only contractors with the best technical qualifications, and preferably contractors with integrity, contractors with ISO 37001 would be great. Then those contractors bid finally for the price, and then you can choose the cheapest because you've already evaluated the technical best. But yeah, it's a risk signal. A very low price contract is a risk signal for corruption later, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's corruption. You could be an ethical contractor, bid very cheaply with a genuine contract and do very good work. So it doesn't prove it's corrupt.
It doesn't prove, but it's an issue because I understand the why this question has been asked, because in some countries, our country is one of those. Usually we select bidders based on the prices, and we go to the least price, so to the low price. Of course, assuming that all the prices, all the bidders will meet the technical specification. But when a competition is based on price, and when you get the lowest, you will have to be careful when during the execution, because the bidder who proposes the lowest prices will try to, because at the end of the day, they should make money and they should make profit, because they are there to make profit. Where do they can make profit is from cheating, from perhaps corrupting the project engineers, and otherwise they cannot recover, and they cannot make a benefit out of this project if they were selected based on the price. That's
right.
It's not a good strategy. The best strategy is to make a balance between the technical offer and the financial offer, and to try to combine them and to come up with the best bidder, and that's it. Otherwise, in some countries, they opt for the best from a technical perspective. Then they will pay the price that will require. So it's different from one country to another. Another question. This one is from Francisco. Let me see, because it's not clear. The massive consequences of delays in contracts are exponentially bigger and unstable economies due to the inflation price actualizations. That's another issue.
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree with the statement. Yes.
I fully agree with this statement. Another questions. How will issue payment certificate to the project owner in case there is no project? No, I think it's not clear this. In case there is no project engineer according to the clause in the definition of project engineer.
I mean, it depends. I'm not sure, some contracts do not have a project engineer, and some contracts you submit the payment application direct to the project owner, and then the project owner will approve the payment or not approve the payment. The advantage of a project engineer is they're meant to be independent, because if you submit, for example, if you submit a payment as a contractor to a project owner who's a public agency, and you're suspicious that the project owner won't pay because they just won't approve your payment. Many contractors won't want to work in that sort of situation. They only want to work in a situation where there's an independent engineer from a reputable organization who's doing the certification. But some contracts don't have an engineer. If the question is what happens if there's meant to be an engineer and one is not appointed, that's a problem. That's a headache. I don't know what would happen in that situation. If the project owner has not appointed the engineer, and they should have, then you've got a gap in the contract structure. this is a problem. There are many problems on construction projects which can't be fitted into an easy answer box because so much can go wrong. So many different circumstances can occur.
Thank you very much. We still have 3 minutes. So, Michael, perhaps you wanted to make some comments, and before we conclude this session, you are muted.
Mike.
Yeah.
I should know that by now. We see so many opportunities for fraud and corruption in these terribly complicated projects. It's a tremendous challenge for auditors, investigators, and oversight personnel. I have many comments, but we'll run out of time. We can talk about them in more detail in later conferences. But one thing I wanted to ask Neill is, can he say what is the highest risk type of contract? In other words, if we're talking about major construction projects and infrastructure, it could be fixed price, it could be remeasured, it could be cost plus. Is there any guidance you can give from experience as to which of those types of contract provide the highest risk and the most examples of fraud and corruption? Because I think what I'm going to do in my own materials, based on your excellent presentations, I'm going to reorganize my general list of red flags that I provide for my clients. And I'm going to organize the list according to project type. So if it's fixed contract, there's certain red flags which might be different than remeasured contracts. And if it's cost plus, there'll be fixed red flags that are different. But I wonder, just in the few minutes we have remaining, is there one type of contract which presents a higher risk than others in these infrastructure projects?
That's a really good question, Mike. And I think from my experience, I would say a road project on a remeasurement basis is where we have been involved the most, because it doesn't have to be a big road, because what you've got with a road project, you've got all the problems of excavation, where has the road been excavated down to the correct layer, the correct foundation layer, and then you've got all the build-up, the different layers of the road, the sub-base, the base layer, the top coat, etc. And their layers covered by other. So first you've got excavation, which is a massive risk. Second, you've got concealment, because you've got each layer is concealed by a layer higher up. And thirdly, it's normally remeasurement. So that, to my mind, compounds, because the contractor can not excavate to the correct depth. They cannot provide the correct amount of aggregate or the correct quality of aggregate for the road. And they can also exaggerate the amount they have provided in their claims. So they can sort of almost triplicate the effect of the fraud. And because the road is quite long, it's very difficult to monitor, and it does take a little bit of time to break up. So the contractors normally got paid before it starts breaking up. So I would say, unquestionably, road projects on a remeasurement basis would be my top of the pile.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful contribution. I see some other questions, but unfortunately, we don't have time to deal with them. I will give the floor to Susan. Perhaps you have some announcement, and then thank you very much once again, and see you in 2 weeks. Okay. Susan, the floor is yours. Yes, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Kamel. Also, thanks a lot to you, Neill, and for the presentation. Thank you, Michael, for your input. That is Michael Kramer and Michael Every, who joined us later on the panel. Thank you so much for all the responses and all the engagements too from our participants. Thank you also for making time and staying with us in this session. And just some quick announcement. The first one is the video of this session will be shared with all of us. So I saw a lot of questions about the video and the PowerPoint. We are sharing the videos with you. The PowerPoints will be shared later on alongside the certification. We have some management system we are working on in the background. We'll give you more information about that so that you can have easy access to these materials and continue the discussions amongst ourselves, so we can learn from our situations in our various spaces. Okay, and then please, the schedule for the training has been shared with us. Please save the dates so that you can make time to be part of all the following sessions that will be coming up all the way till June next year. We have some interactions we will be continuing through that process. The next training session, the next workshop comes off in about 2 weeks' time. On Wednesday, the 6th of November, we will be going into a session with Christoph Stackelberger, the founder of Globethics. He will be talking about "We do not give up: values and old new strategies for reducing corruption for the next decade." So we look forward to seeing you all again, and all those who are here and those who will be watching in absentia, please, we look forward to having you in the next session. Thank you, and that is all from us for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Any comments from the panelists? Yes, okay then. Thank you, and
Thank
bye
you.
for now.
Bye, and see you within 2 weeks.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.